Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, SuperPOSITRON, for having me come and give a talk. I'm going to be talking about how to take an idea and build it into a startup. I am happy to take Q&A during this. I will try to watch the chat, or if Samantha, if you want to pause me and say, hey, we have a question in the chat, if I don't happen to see it, please do pause me since I have slides up and it might be hard to track both. But yeah, happy to make this very conversational. I will start out with a little bit of an intro about 1517 and my journey, and then we will get into some storytelling about how people started their startups and where they began. So we've already done sort of the hand part of this slide, which was talking about if anyone here is interested in making a startup. And we had a few people talk about apps that they wanted to make. One person who talked about wanting to start a comic. And I don't know if that was like a print comic or a web comic, but we were talking about how something can start out as a single idea and very much grow into something else. And the definition of a startup inherently means something that scales. And so, for example, I had a tutoring company as my very first business, and I would not have called that a startup. I would have called it a business for sure, and it was a great business, but I didn't have the particular want to grow it into a huge tutoring company and have centers all across the US or anything like that. But I don't, one thing I want to caveat about this talk is that not everything is supposed to be a startup, and that's okay. My first business was a tutoring company, and I made, just enough money to sort of support myself. I eventually did have a couple other tutors that I hired and was able to bring in other forms of income through that. But not everything has to be a startup. And I just say that because I think startups have gotten very popular, and there's this notion that if you're not doing a startup, that you're doing something wrong. And I just think that is extremely untrue. So I'm just going to put that out there that, yeah, you can start a business of any kind. And the great thing about, being, especially a woman doing a startup is that you get to start it yourself. So that means you get to be the C-suite, you get to be at the top of your company, and you get to build the culture that you want. So I think it's something really powerful, for people to think about. So to tell you a little bit more about 1517, we are a small team. There's 4 of us. We are fully remote at this point because of the pandemic. We used to have an office in San Francisco, but I am the only one left in the Bay Area at this point. My colleague Mike is in Colorado. My colleague Zach is in Pittsburgh, and my colleague Nick is in Indiana. And so how did we start 1517? My colleague Michael and I were on the founding team of the Thiel Fellowship Program, which was a grant program started by Peter Thiel back in 2010. That sounds like ancient history at this point, but it was 11 years ago. And the reason the fellowship started was to, one, help to prove out that there were other paths other than going to college, that you could have a successful career in a life by doing something different. And that could be starting a nonprofit, that could be doing a startup, that could be doing independent research. We actually also had an artist who was part of the fellowship who made independent, what they called playable posts, actually. It was sort of like a web comic. It was very, very neat. The person's name is Nikki Case, especially for that person here who is into comics. You might want to look them up. But we supported people to do things very independently with $100,000 over the course of 2 years. It was a grant, and we talked about projects a lot. We didn't know where things would go. And so we were very fortunate in running that program. We got to work with young people from largely across the US, and a few young people actually on this slide have gone on to do some really big things. It's actually funny. I have the Zoom call open so much that I was like, okay, I can't see everybody on this slide, but now I can. Some people might know Ritesh, who's down in the bottom middle. He is the founder of Oyo Rooms, which is now the 2nd largest hotel chain in the world. When Oyo started, and this kind of gets at some of the topic of this talk, what Ritesh wanted to do was make an Airbnb clone for India, but he knew that, someone who was, for example, on the Airbnb team wasn't going to just be able to replicate it there. He understood the culture better and what was going on, so he thought he could do it. And so some of our first calls with Ritesh, he would be in the background fluffing pillows, at someone's home, trying to make it an accommodation for something like what would become an Airbnb for India, but he actually found that that model wasn't working out so well there, so they became a hotel chain. And so it's really amazing. On last count, this was a couple of years ago, I know they had something like 10,000 employees. I don't even know what they're up to at this point. But it's amazing because, you know, it started with Ritesh as this one person with an idea. And oftentimes with startups, we talk about what we're looking for in people are these people who have this really big mission, and they have this idea for what something will look like 10 years down the line. But what I like to ask people is like, well, on the other side over here, what are you doing on Friday? How are you going to get started on that? And so we look for this combination of people who have both big mission, but also know how to start executing on something. And what are the very small steps, putting one foot in front of the other that you can do to get started. Another person to point out on this slide that some people might know is Austin Russell of Luminar Technologies. He's to the left of Ritesh. In this photo, he's about 17 years old. That's when we started with him. He's about 25, and he started a company called Luminar Technologies that makes a LiDAR sensor for autonomous vehicles, and they are partnered up with Volvo right now. And I believe they are slated to be in the 2022 Volvo's doing assisted driving and then eventually moving towards full autonomy. His company went public last year, and it's been really amazing to know this young man since he was 17, and again had this like really big idea for something. And in fact, when they were starting the company, they didn't know if they were going to go into autonomous driving with LiDAR or if they would go into special effects with movies. So they had a lot of choices to make along the way, but it was all about that. Hey, what are you doing on Friday? How are you taking those little steps to get somewhere? So we were really charmed to be able to work with some really extraordinary people. You know, others also include people like Vitalik Buterin from Ethereum. We worked with him from the very beginning. So my colleague and I, when we started 1517, we'd been at the fellowship for 5 years, and we had seen these great outcomes from people, but we also saw some of the downsides of when people would start something that, you know, could be a company where investors weren't taking young founders seriously. They weren't taking people who didn't have a BA or a BS from, you know, a top tier school seriously, certainly not taking you serious if you weren't going to school at all. And so we were seeing these really amazing outcomes from people, and we were saying, hey, you know, well, maybe the way to help fund these people is for myself and Michael, that's my colleague right here on the slide, maybe we can just become investors and we can help them to go the next mile. And just as a point of reference, I have no business, you know, being in venture capital. I guess I do now since I've done it for 6 years, but when I first joined the fellowship, I had been a charter school founder and a school principal and an educator for many years. And so had someone asked me 11 years ago, would you be in, you know, VC venture capital? I would have said, what's VC? I didn't know anything about the industry. Similarly, my colleague has a background in philosophy and history. So he was also not sort of supposed to be on this path. So we like to back very unlikely people, and we see ourselves as very unlikely people for what we're doing. So some people will ask, like, how'd you get your name? What does 1517 mean? And 1517 is a historic year. It's when Martin Luther nailed his theses, you know, as here on the picture, to a church door and said, hey, I think it's wrong that the church is selling a very expensive piece of paper called an indulgence. And we like to say likewise, you know, when we started the fund actually in 2015, we said, hey, it's also wrong that there's another institution, higher education, saying to become an educated person, you have to pay for this very expensive piece of paper. We think there's many ways to have a successful future. And some of that could look like, you know, going to undergrad or getting a PhD. Some of that can look like going to a boot camp. Some of that could be by starting work. Some of that can be starting your own thing. So just want to touch on a couple little things, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. One thing that I like people to know is that we're not just a venture capital fund. We also give grants to people. I have a fairy godmother here because we call it a fairy godmother moment. Sometimes we'll meet people at a hackathon or an event like this, and they'll say, hey, I really want to take this project I'm working on further. And in the next 3 months, I'd like to, you know, buy these certain components and parts. And I'd like to work on it and see where it goes. And sometimes I'll say to people, hey, what would you do with $1,000? And they'll tell me about it. And I'll say, okay, great. What's your Venmo? I'm going to send you $1,000. And they're very surprised. They're like, wait, I just applied for your grant. And I said, well, there is no application. So yes, you technically applied for it. So if anybody is listening who is working on something, whether it's for SuperPOSITRON or for something else that you're like, gosh, I could really use a little bit of grant money in a Venmo payment, feel free to email me. My email is just in my name on the Zoom, Danielle@1517fund.com. So that's one thing we do. We also do capital partnership. This slide isn't coming through so clear, but that's a cat surrounded by lots of money. People who might know us at 1517 know that we are big into cats. And I want to tell you now some stories of how some founders have gotten started. So here is an example, and I like to tell people that it takes less than you think to get going. A lot of times when we see a startup, what we see is the end product. We see, hey, this group has, hundreds of thousands of users, and everything's going, and they have revenue, and they have a team of, hundreds and hundreds or thousands of people. But it often starts with just one or two people and an idea. So one of these people, Cade on the left, he was at Duke University when I met him, and he loves running. And so one thing that we talk to our founders a lot about is that you have to have a sustaining motivation for what you're doing. A lot of people get into startups because they think it's like the popular thing to do. And they think it's going to bring them fame and fortune. And if it does those things, it's after a very long period of time with a lot of hard work. And what I like to say is a lot of pain and suffering. Startups are not easy, and it really has to be a labor of love. So if you're thinking about going down this path, you want to think about something that is very important to you, and also likely something that you have some experience with. And so Cade is a marathon runner. And one of the things that he noticed was that it's very hard to get access to races as a video. There are services that do this, but if you want to train and you want to see a course before you run it, it's often very expensive. And so he said, hey, wait a second, we all have smartphones, and why can't races be recorded? And when we met him at Duke, we thought, wow, this is an interesting idea. And we gave him $1,000 to get started as a Venmo payment. And he went out and he got a very expensive shopping cart. Actually, he didn't pay anything for it. So he borrowed this from a grocery store. He strapped a GoPro to the front of it. Actually, he used our $1,000 to in part get that GoPro, and he strapped it to the front, and he got up at 4 a.m. and he recorded a piece of one of the marathons that was coming up in his area. And this was his MVP, known as his minimal viable product. This was his way of getting started with something and showing, okay, I can record a race. This is the first thing I need to do. I said something earlier about doing, one foot in front of the other. Cade's story is a great example of this, where he just keeps putting one foot in front of the other, building this product. And it literally took getting a shopping cart to do it. I have seen demos of things that have started with spreadsheets. I've seen demos of things that start with a lot of duct tape. In fact, earlier today, I'm in Austin, Texas right now. I'm in a hotel room. So I don't know what this headboard is back here, but it's rather interesting. But yeah, actually, I wish I had taken pictures of it. I was just at one of my companies called MadeBot, and they make a robot for cleaning hotels. And I was just there, and they just showed me all the different iterations of their product from the very first one that they started, I think about 5 years ago. And it looked really scrappy. It was basically like duct tape and wires and plastic pieces to sort of prove out a concept. And actually now they have made a pretty industrial looking robot that they are deploying with a hotel chain, actually starting on Friday. I can't say which one, but they're deploying 23 robots, and they've done some different pilots with some different hotel chains. But over the pandemic, for example, because there wasn't a lot going on with hotels, it was their time to say, you know what, the best use of our time is to go back and do a lot of R&D. So we're going to redo this robot. So now I'm kicking myself that I didn't take a picture of all the iterations that they had, but I can show you one picture of the latest one. I don't know if it's going to come through super well because I'm sort of on the fly right now, just going, oh, I should have taken these pictures. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick. Oh, here we go. So I'm going to move it close. So this is the latest iteration. This is actually without any industrial design done to it. It kind of looks like an old fax machine right now. They were like, yeah, this is our 80s looking robot, but it will be more nicely designed. But they showed it to me and it runs really smooth and does a great job. They can actually clean a room in 6 minutes, whereas the best Roomba right now can do a room in about 23 minutes. And so these types of savings are really important to hotels. But it's interesting to watch what happens that, the robot that I just showed you really started with a bunch of wires and some duct tape and getting simple. And so similarly with Cade's app New Run, which is what it's called, he started by taking a shopping cart, sticking a GoPro to the front and running a partial race. And so then he started, getting runners on from the San Francisco Marathon. He was actually slated to be doing the Boston Marathon, but I understand that they just canceled it because of COVID. And so a lot of companies are having to face the up and down challenges of, what do you do when something interferes with your startup that you can't predict, like a pandemic, or supply chain issues are really big for hardware companies right now because of the pandemic. And so even companies like MadeBot that I was just talking about, they've had to get very creative with how they get components and things like that. So sometimes things look, like they're all smooth on the surface. And I assure you that there's a lot of work going on underneath. I'm going to take a second for some water. All right. And I'm going to keep going here. Okay, so I've got another story for you all that I'll share. This is Stephen Balaban from a company called Lambda Labs. And this company first started as something called DreamScope. So this was also probably about 5 years ago. We knew Stephen from the Teal Fellowship because he was a mentor actually to some of our Teal Fellows. And he came to myself and Michael one day and said, hey, I think, and today this is commonplace, but at the time this was novel. He said, I can take your picture in a Picasso and I could put them together and I can make your picture as a Picasso, or as a Monet or whatever, artist you happen to be into. And we said, that's kind of interesting. And we knew that he had the technical chops to do it, but what we didn't know was, would he have the ability to get users on? And so he started building the app. And it was going really well. They were making really beautiful images. We actually used it sometimes to change our logo around a bit. It was kind of fun. And they had fairly decent traction. And traction is really the metrics that you're gaining with users over time. Sometimes investors will ask, like, what's your traction? And that means sort of what exists right now and who's using it. And it was decent. However, another company, probably about 6 months later, came out of the woodwork called Prisma. And they just knew how to do growth marketing. So our people's algorithm was way better and faster, but Prisma had the growth marketing down. And before we knew it, whenever we would say anything about like, hey, your picture with a Picasso, people would go, oh, Prisma. And we'd be like, uh-oh, like, DreamScope is losing mind share with people. And so our team was sort of becoming a bunch of Eeyores. They were very much in the doldrums and things were not going well. And our team actually, this is sort of a lesson that we learned. Sometimes founders will think, oh, if I raise a lot of money, this is good because it will give me the net that I need to do something. But the problem with having a lot of money is oftentimes founders don't know how to spend it. And there's something about having excess resources that makes people less creative. I'm sure people have done more research on this, but also in our observations, we've seen that the teams who have just enough to work with also have a lot of creative juice that they're moving with because they can't say, hey, I've got 3 years of runway. They know, okay, I've got 8 months to a year of runway, maybe something like 18 months, a year and a half at most, but that goes pretty quick. But our team had something like a few years of runway and their app wasn't going well. And in fact, we were picking up our colleague, Nick, on the way to a review with our founders. And we were telling Nick in the car, he had come into San Francisco airport and we picked him up and we said, hey, we're heading over to DreamScope today. And this team is just in the doldrums. They're not doing well. Prisma is just taking over, and we don't know how to get them to stop running this company. Like, in fact, we often will feel guilty because the founders we work with are often so young in their careers that we want them to get onto something that is going to be successful. And that doesn't even mean working on their startup. It could be working for somebody else. It could be starting something different. For some people, it's going back to school. Like, we believe that success begets success. And if what you're working on isn't working, we don't want you to keep doing that. And so we were telling Nick this as we were driving down to Palo Alto. And then we got to the office and I see these boxes everywhere and this bubble wrap. And this is the founder, Stephen. And I looked around in my face. I still remember being very confused walking in, because remember, these guys had an app. And I looked around and I saw all these boxes and I saw all this bubble wrap. And I also saw some computer towers sort of sitting on floors. And I said to Stephen, "Are you guys starting a computer company?" And they go, "Yeah, we're starting a computer company." I said, "Okay, well, one, I'm glad I'm here for our founder review, because thanks for letting me know about the really big pivot you all have made. And also, how did this happen?" And they said, "Oh, well, Dreamscope hasn't been going very well, but we noticed that to build Dreamscope, we needed to have certain computers, with certain capabilities on it to do deep learning. And we built those from scratch ourselves. And it just happened to be that we had a second computer sitting in the corner collecting dust. So we decided, well, what if we just put this on Amazon, put up a dummy landing page, and just saw if we could sell it?" So they put it on Amazon for $11,000, and within 24 hours, they sold it to somebody about 3 towns over in Cupertino, which is where Apple is located. They literally boxed up the computer, put it in their car, and drove it to this guy's house and set it up for them. And that's how their current business started, which is now called Lambda Labs. And so they make deep learning workstations and they make laptops, and actually they have a cloud computing service now. They just raised a Series A round and they've been doing really well. And so they went from being this team that was in the doldrums and sort of like on the verge of death, to having a company that is profitable and running. And a lot of it was about getting creative. And I was really glad they did. It's funny, I saw Stephen the other day. I should ask him, like, what was the moment that you decided to give up on Dreamscope? Because they could have kept going on it for a long time because they had way too much money, and they could have just tried more growth hacks and, tried more advertising and all of this. But at some point they said, enough is enough, let's try something different. So it's really important for teams to be able to do this. So there's a couple lessons that we like to tell people about. Some of them are kind of goofy, so just hang on with me on these. But we think that communication is really important between team members. And one of them is about being proactive. This is me being very goofy here. And, with the people you're working with, and that can be your team members, that could be your investors. I often like to say that your parents are your first investors. Like, there's sometimes the people who, you have to sort of convince, like, hey, I want to try something really different. Or, hey, is it okay if I come live at home while I build something? So you want to be really proactive with people in terms of being able to say what you're doing. The other strategy is to sort of be reactive with people and only communicate sort of when you have to. And we don't think that's a good idea. There's another thing that we often see where in people's communication, they'll start measuring metrics way, way, way too early. In fact, we've seen it a lot where other pre-seed funds, so we're pre-seed fund, and what that means is that we're often the first check into a company. So sometimes people will be raising, somewhere between 500K and 2 million. It's kind of a wide range at this point. And some fund managers who are also early stage like us will say, hey, every week or every month, we want this team to send us their statistics of how they're doing. But we think that if you're measuring the wrong thing, then it means that your team is going off on this like wild goose chase for something that doesn't exist. So it's really important to us that your stats actually matter and that you're measuring something important. So in our purview, we think that your first year of your company should really be about a lot of experimentation. So we think that, be careful about starting to measure something too early, because you might be measuring the complete wrong thing. Also on communication, one thing we like to say is that if you do have investors or you have advisors that you're working with, send them a once a month update and tell them what's going on. I can't tell you the number of times when I'll hear from someone who is a co-investor in a company and they'll say, oh, I haven't heard from, I'll just make it up. I'll say it's Stephen at Lambda, but oh, I haven't heard from Stephen at Lambda. What's going on with the company? And they don't know. But because at 1517, we have our review structures and things like this. We also have something on Fridays we call coffee and troubleshooting, where people will get on a call and talk about how things are going. So we are very in the loop on what's happening, but most fund managers aren't organized in this particular way. And so it's really important to be able to send people updates. Also, something you have to think about a lot is team fighting. If you have a team, you will fight. It's not if, it's a when. Myself and Michael have worked together for 11 years at this point. And when teams are under stress, and for us, this means like when we were raising our second fund, we are 2 funds in right now. We're probably going to be raising our third fund sometime by the end of this year. But when we were raising our second fund, it was very, very stressful. And those things that sort of irk you about each other when things are okay really, really bother you when a team is under stress. And so we always tell our startup founders, hey, basically when your team is under-resourced, that's when you're going to start going at it with each other. And it's not that there's something wrong with your team. It doesn't mean you're working with the wrong person. It doesn't mean that you're the wrong person to be working on this. It's systemic to startups and it's systemic to working on teams, that these types of pressures are going to come up. And so we always try to remind people to not take these things personally, and just remember that your goal is to keep working on the problem instead of working on the blame. And so if you're blaming your co-founder and you're pointing fingers a lot, you're going to waste a lot of time. But if you keep saying, okay, we liken it to surgery. We're like, okay, there's a body on the table and you need to work on it. If you can keep focused on that, then you're going to solve your problem. But 2 surgeons who are fighting each other in the operating room, that body is going to die. And so that is not a great way to do things. And then let's see. Oh, it's funny. I have talked over a bunch of my slides without knowing it. We also talk about, you've got to celebrate the small wins, and just like a sports team, you got to be able to say, hey, we did good today, and take a moment and really take that in and know that things are a very long marathon instead of a sprint to get there. If you have a startup, you're going to be doing it for a very, very, very long time. I'm going to go to a last slide, but then I'll tell a couple more stories that aren't in these slides yet, because I haven't gotten to adding them. So if you want to reach out, actually, you can just reach out to me directly, Danielle at 1517fund.com. I always tell people I'm happy to talk about any ideas you're working on. We sometimes jokingly say we give bad life advice. And so if you're thinking about like, hey, what should I be doing in school? Or I'm having trouble figuring out what to study, like we actually have those conversations a lot with people as well. I will stop sharing my screen at this point, and I'll just tell a couple more stories off the cuff. So a couple other stories that come to mind that some of you might know the companies of is we have a company called Loom. They are an asynchronous video tool where people can sort of go back and forth on something, and it records your face and your screen. And so actually over the pandemic, a lot of educators used it to teach their classes. And that was also sort of an interesting lesson for how to get something started where, the team is 3 people to start, and they had this idea of, hey, we think people are communicating improperly. So again, it's that big vision of something. And they thought, well, maybe people could be more efficient. And maybe communication doesn't always have to be in real time. And maybe a lot of meetings are a waste. And so they made this tool where it can record your face talking, but also your screen. So I'll use it for pitch deck feedback actually quite a lot, or designers will use it to give feedback on things. Sometimes people will use it for code review, educators will use it to teach. But at the time when they built it, it was called Open Test, and they didn't know who was going to use it. And so just like what we were talking about of like taking those small steps to get somewhere, they had actually pitched us 3 times before we invested. We said no at least twice, if not 3 times originally. And we were the first institutional fund to come in. They had a couple angel investors who had written smaller checks, but that was it. And they didn't know who their users would be yet or how they would use it, but they experimented with putting it on Product Hunt. So they launched on Product Hunt, and they got a great review. Like, they had people who were looking at it, but it wasn't like blowing it out of the water. It wasn't super clear, but it was enough conviction for us to say, hey, okay, we think there's going to be people out there who will try this. They started slowly trying to sell into engineering teams to see if they could get teams to use it. And so that was another step, was instead of trying to sell to a whole company, they tried first selling to team members. And actually, it has taken them a very long time to figure out their pricing model. That company is, they're at least 5, if not 6 years old at this point. And they didn't even really launch pricing until last year. They had sort of experimented with it multiple times, but the hard part about pricing is that if you put pricing on your product really early, you won't know if people aren't buying it because they don't like it or because they don't like the price you set on it. And so oftentimes we'll tell teams, like, we'd way rather you put something out there free and get as much feedback on it as you can than try to sell it for compensation early, but then just not know if you just overshot on price, and that's why people won't use it. So Loom didn't charge anything, I think, until about last year. And they just kept experimenting and getting tons and tons of feedback. I also think they did some interesting things on the leadership side. I very much respect Vinay, who's one of the co-founders. And in fact, I think next week we're going to meet up in San Francisco. He just got a dog, and I used to do animal training. So I'm like, yeah, let's get together. We'll teach your dog some tricks. This will be great. And he said, okay, let's do it. So I'm excited to see him soon, because he's usually just so busy with their company at this point. They're a Series C company. And so there's a lot of pressure on them to build and to grow even more. But one thing I really respect what he did was that he didn't take on the title of CTO until about 1.5 years ago. And so he just had the title head of engineering for a long time. And the reason that he did that was because he knew he needed to grow into the role. And I think that's really important. I'll see a lot of founders who on their pitch decks will put, like, I'm the CEO, I'm the CTO. And my belief is that you're not a C-suite anything until you're managing other people. And so oftentimes what I like to see is people just saying, like, hey, I'm, there's 2 founders, 3 founders, whatever it is. And what I'm heading up is engineering, or hey, I'm doing sales, or hey, I'm doing fundraising. And then you grow over time into the position. So I think it's really interesting that even with a very successful company, Vinay said, you know what, I don't know if I'm supposed to be the CTO of this company, but I'm going to try to grow into that role over time. And if I think that I'm earning it, then I will move into that position, and it'll be a talk amongst the C-suite and the board. And now he is the CTO of the company, but he waited a really long time to do that. And so I think they did some really interesting things in terms of getting lots of user feedback early, but also really growing into their roles as founders over time, and not just like slapping a label on themselves. And I've seen this a lot. Some of our other companies, the CTO and the CEO will switch roles after a while, because they'll realize, oh, wait, the other person is better at the sales part, or the other person is better at the technical part. And so I always advise teams, like, just call yourself a founder and just say the things that you're taking ownership of. You don't have to necessarily define your roles really early. So those are just a bunch of stories. I'm happy to open up for questions. We have about like 20 minutes left. If people want to throw questions in the chat, or if they want to unmute themselves and ask a question. And if you want to ask a specific question about your work, by all means, feel free, and you can talk a little bit about what you're doing, and I can help you troubleshoot it. Oh, we got a hand up for Ezra.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Ezra.
Yeah, so I have a question. Like, I have an idea, and I'm still in the idea stage of my project, and I want to like to develop it and grow it, but I have like no prior experience in business or something like this. Like, do you know any virtual incubator program or accelerator who can just help me, to start like my first step business?
Yeah. So what I will say is that the people who give you your best feedback are the people who are your beta users or your first customers on something. And so I very much do like incubators, but the thing is that the people you're trying to test something with, those are the people that you want to talk to the most. And so even though it's your first time doing something, you want to constantly be getting feedback from the people you're trying to deliver something to. As far as incubators, and I don't know exactly who is doing remote versus in person anymore, but I really love the Techstars programs. I think they do a fantastic job mentoring people, and they're really for the lifetime of the company. Some incubators I notice, it's kind of like you're in while you're in, but once the incubator is done, I don't think the service holds up as much, but I really, really enjoy the Techstars programs and what they do, in part because they're also very specific. So if you have a specific, area you're working in, they can kind of help you out to figure out, okay, how to do this better. But again, all these incubators, one of the first things they'll tell you is call 100 people, email 100 people, get in touch with as many customers as you can. And so I think sometimes really what people need to do is just be talking to other people. And sometimes a program will help you to do that. But if you know who you're supposed to talk to, as far as your customers are trying to figure that out, they will guide you the absolute most, way more than the incubator will, because the incubator is there to give you advice, but your customers are there to give you feedback.
Yeah, thank you. And like another question,
Yeah.
do you think like the startup should be brand new, creative, an idea that does not exist, or it's okay like just to make depend on our passion and just to make something that we like, even if it is exists maybe in another country, but maybe
Yeah.
it is not exist in my country. So
Yeah.
do you think like it is okay, or it should be like a brand new, like a completely different creative idea?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a fan of both. There are a lot of things that do not exist in other countries that end up becoming big companies because they got taken to another country. Ritesh with Oyo Rooms is kind of like that. And, he didn't create Airbnb in India, but that's how he started it. And I think that there's a lot that people can do to say, hey, you know what, culture matters, and knowing a culture really matters to selling to a culture. And so I think you can do either. I mean, I think actually a lot of ideas are worthwhile to experiment with. I think sometimes what's hard for founders to know is that if what they're working on is something that a lot of other people are working on, which therefore makes it harder for investment dollars to come in, because it means that there's oversaturation, meaning like too many people are working on the same problem, and it can be tough to know when that happens or not. But as far as problem space, yeah, if you want to do totally new ideas, that's great. But if you want to take something that exists and bring it somewhere else, I would do a lot of research and figure out why doesn't it exist there, or who's tried to do it and maybe why didn't it work, because timing is also a huge component of a company working. So I'm a fan of both.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I think I saw something in the chat. Okay. So what is your profession? I didn't quite catch that. Okay. So I work in venture capital. And so I'll start a little bit, backwards. My earliest profession, I actually thought I was going to become a psychologist at one point. I thought I was going down the neuropsych path. I worked in a hospital. I worked with patients. It was a really interesting career, but I kind of had an early quarter life crisis and made a left turn and said, hey, you know what? I really like neuropsych a lot, and I'm getting a lot of kudos from other people for going down this path, but it's not my passion. It's not the thing I'm eating, breathing, and drinking every day. And it was certainly not something I thought about when I was younger. And when I thought about what professions I really loved, teaching came to mind. But I had already finished school, and I thought, I'm not going to go back to school for teaching now that I'm done with school. So instead, I became a private tutor. And that's how I started my first tutoring company. And I think one thing that was true for me was that both my parents have started small businesses. And what I didn't realize was that I had learned a lot growing up just watching my parents run their business. And so it kind of came as second nature to me of like, oh yeah, I'll put ads up, and I will always contact people within 24 hours of getting in touch. And like, I was just doing these things automatically because I'd seen my family do it. So I ran a tutoring company for 5 years, and then I actually opened up a charter school in San Diego called Innovations Academy that still exists to this day. We serve 400 students a year, and I'm still on the board. That's probably one of the crowning achievements of my career, is just having something that now outlives me. Like, I don't work there anymore and it still runs, which is a really incredible feeling. Then I joined the Teal Foundation, where I directed the programs there under Peter Teal. And then now I run my own venture capital fund. And so as a venture capitalist, my main job is to fund companies and then support their growth. So thank you for having me clarify that, because it probably was not clear from the beginning. Other questions people have? We have about maybe 10 minutes or so to go. Or anyone want to talk about what they're working on and do a little troubleshooting?
I mean, I could continue the conversation on that.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. I'm currently working on 2 projects. I'll talk about, I guess, like the one I'm more focused on right now. So it's basically a kind of like clean water, so like filtration solution. Like, I mean, you've probably like heard a bunch about those because there are so many on the market.
Yep.
But essentially, our idea is using polysaccharide aerogels to filter industrial and agricultural waste from polluted drinking water. And it's been kind of fun looking to the chemistry of everything. So,
Yeah.
I mean, like, other people might know, but I do have like a little bit of like a background in chemistry with like chemistry awards and everything. And so I was looking into a bunch of research papers, doing like as much as I could. And I also contacted a ton of different experts as well, looking into like trying to like validate that like the chemistry works. Of course, like that specific field is, I guess, like kind of niche. Actually getting into contact with those researchers was also really difficult, and like the response rate was a lot lower than I think most tech startups, because I think like when you're working with like blockchain or something, when you're working with AI, reaching out to experts and finding people that are experts in that field is a lot easier to do than when you're looking into polysaccharide aerogels.
Sure.
So it was really hard to get into contact with them. And when we did, they were like, yeah, like the chemistry seems like it works. But then I finally got in contact with someone who I think has more like a better understanding of everything in general, and kind of explained that like, okay, this part of the chemistry actually doesn't work because of this. So I guess like it's kind of like a two-parter. Like, how do you like go about things where it's kind of hard to find experts in your area? And then the second part is like, what do you do when you kind of like reach this sort of block, when you realize that like one thing in your I just said thing like twice, but one like aspect of your project like might not work, or like it might completely just like might not work at all.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
You might not even be sure of yourself because you don't have the knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of people that we work with are inventors. And so they don't know if the thing they're building is going to work. To the point about how to work with experts, I do think that you can use sort of like age and student status to your advantage to say, and I think sometimes if you frame things a little bit more like a project, or like, hey, this thing's for school or a class, like people are maybe a little more willing to take the time. And so sometimes I don't recommend lying. Like, I don't think you should say like, oh yeah, I'm only doing a school project, but you might say like, oh, hey, I'm working on something in this space. I'm really interested in the study of X, and hoping to get people to help. It's also hard in different fields too, because like I imagine for your field, you can't just go on like LinkedIn and find these people. So you're probably scouring research papers, trying to email them, they're inundated. The other thing I would think about is who are the people who surround the people that you want to get in touch with. So then I would start thinking about grad students. I'd be like, okay, who are the people who are under the people that I want to get in touch with? Because they probably also know quite a bit of information, maybe not as much as the person that you want, but maybe enough to help you out. And they're going to have more time because nobody knows who they are. Like, no one is asking them for their time yet as a student. So you might think about kind of trying to go around the person you're trying to get to instead of directly to that person. But I also think that, especially, while you're a student, you can use that to your advantage to say like, hey, can I get 30 minutes to talk to you about about X. But you are absolutely right. It's going to be harder to find people who are deeply technical in an area, in part because it's a search problem. So hopefully my answer is at least vaguely helpful. On the like, okay, well, what do you do if it doesn't work? That's a really tough one, because like the answer is like, well, why isn't it working? Is it that there is an inherent reason why it isn't working, or is it that you need to tinker with something just a little bit more to get it there? And I don't have a good answer for like, when is the time to like put your sword down and just be like, okay, I'm done. Like this, this is not going in the direction I want. I think something to think about is like trying to determine for yourself, like what the best decision is and how long you have to work on something. So if you're like, okay, I have 3 months to figure this out and to talk to an expert about something, and to experiment, then that's going to give you at least some of that creative constraint of this isn't forever. You're not going to be digging for the needle in the haystack forever. You're only going to be taking a certain amount of time to do it. And I'm trying to think like, I'm trying to think of some of we have a lot of deeply technical founders. And like my sense of things with them is that they just keep trying. Is that generally, I guess one way to say it, one way to say it is they have a goal they're going for, but they don't try to only attack from one angle. They're not just like, I'm going to do it this way. If this way isn't working, they pivot to this way. If this way doesn't work, they pivot to this way. And actually a really sort of clean example of this is one of our first Teal fellows, Eden Full. She is totally an inventor, and she started a nonprofit originally called the Sun Saluter. And the idea was that, all these people, especially in developing countries, are sometimes given these solar panels, but it's like, oh, goody, they're putting it up against, a house or like on something, but stationary. And so she thought, I bet they could garner something like 40% more power if the solar panel was on something that rotated. And when she first started the fellowship, she thought like, okay, I've got like a high-tech solution for this. And she kept working at this very, very high-tech solution for how to make it rotate on this platform that she built. And after a while, I remember we were in a review with her, and she started crying during the review. And we were like, Eden, what is the matter? And she says, I figured out how to make the Sun Saluter work, but it's like terrible. It's not high tech at all. And I was like, okay, like, isn't the idea to solve this problem and get 40% more energy to people and not like how you do it? She goes, no, it's like really, really dumb. And I can't believe I didn't think of it before. And I was like, okay, Eden, like, what did you think? And what she thought about was kind of like, she was doing something with buckets of water. And so it was not a high technical solution at all. It was like, okay, if I put like water on this side of the thing and I let it run off onto this side, it's going to rotate at a certain rate. And she's like, this is ridiculous. I can't believe I didn't think of this before. I've been trying to do like a high-tech fancy solution. But she's like, what I'm also realizing is that the places I'm putting this panel, they're not going to be able to fix this thing if it breaks, if I build this high-tech solution. But yes, do they have wood? Do they have buckets of water? Do they have things, that are more like, procurable? And she's crying and crying and crying during this meeting. And I was like, Eden, like, you're solving the problem. Like, I don't care if it's high tech or not. And that's how she started doing it. And that's how she was able to get more power to people, was to do this other solution for it. And so what I would say is, like, if something's not working, like, try a different angle on it. Because it sounds like you have some sort of inkling for how this could work better. And what I like to say is that that's like an itch to scratch. And it's like, okay, you have this inkling that it could be done in a different way. Can you think of 2 or 3 other ways that you might also attack the same thing, and see if one of those works better than the one that maybe you're like hitting your head up against the wall on?
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. And like what you're saying about how like you probably won't be able to find the people you want on LinkedIn, like that was definitely true. Like, because we first started through like research papers, but then contacting through that was also difficult. And then we were able to contact some people on LinkedIn, but usually the response was I don't think I'm qualified to like answer your questions, or it was like, the last time I touched aerogels was 5 years ago when I was still working like doing my PhD, like writing my thesis or whatever.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of like people on LinkedIn are kind of like isn't like the same group of people, I guess,
No.
that, is doing this kind of stuff.
Nope.
And I also like think like your idea of like pivoting or trying to look at like attacking at a different angle is also really helpful as well. Like, like that meeting was kind of, it felt defeating. Just like, it was like pretty harsh, like the things that he was saying. But
Yep.
he also did mention that like there are different ways you can attack, and it is actually easier than what you're actually thinking of right now. And it's kind of like pretty much the same thing, except like there's just one less step in the manufacturing process. It just kind of makes the shipment a little bit more difficult, like the transportation. We actually haven't like looked into that yet, but like it's kind of like there's still hope. So
yeah, well, and the thing is too, is like the less time you spend on something that doesn't work, the quicker you can get to something that does. And so I think school is kind of a funky place where we're taught like, if I can't get the answer in the first go, there's something like bad or wrong with me, or this doesn't work, so it means something about how I've tried to do something. But in the world of startups and inventors, it's like, this is par for the course. This is how you invent something, is by going after something and learning like, okay, this thing didn't work. Okay, is there another solution? And trying something else and trying again and again and again and again. And I think it's an admirable quality, but it's not one that, if you try again and again and again on a math test, someone's going to say like, you're not good at math. They're not going to say like, oh, you've got grit and perseverance and wow, good for you for trying again. Like that's very rare to hear. So I think sometimes we just have to take a different mindset at these things and be thankful for the harsh feedback. And like the hard part is like sometimes people who are in an industry for a long time, they do really know what they're talking about, but they've also been in it so long that sometimes they're not able to see something that's different. So it's tough. So I would say take the feedback with a grain of salt. Like, yeah, they probably know what they're talking about and they're probably right. But if there's like some percentage that you're like, well, yeah, given the constraints of the way they think about it, they are right. But if maybe you think about it a little differently, could it work for you? Maybe. Like, and that's what experimentation is for. But like, don't keep hitting your head up against the wall for the same problem again and again. Like, move on to something where you're going to be constantly learning. Because even if what you're learning is this doesn't work, that's more learning than if you keep doing the same thing and you're like, oh, it still doesn't work. It still doesn't work. Like, someone says like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And I think that is very true.
Yeah, I've been told like fail fast like all the time, and that's like how you're able to just like iterate and do better, like just by failing and being okay with that. And then like on the second part, like people who are like in the industry for a while kind of like don't see new things. Like I also saw that in that meeting as well. He was kind of just like bringing up this other technology. He's like, yeah, maybe you should like look into that or something. Like I had heard of it before, but then it's like he's bringing up the idea, but then I'm kind of just like in my head, well, where's like the innovation in that? If like this is like already like a commonplace thing, right? And we're trying to introduce this new sort of idea. So yeah, I definitely like agree with like a lot of what you said.
Yeah. And feel free to reach out anytime. And thank you, Samantha, so much for bringing up a very like real life example of like, okay, here's what's going on. Cause that's when you can get into really interesting troubleshooting with people. And I'm sure a lot of people who are listening learned a lot hearing what you're going through.
Yeah. We actually also like got to 10 p.m. right on the dot.
Yes, I know. I'm like, here we are. And I know you all have other things to do. But thank you so much. And oh yes, someone's putting in the chat. Yeah, feel free to contact me anytime. And I look forward to hearing from people. Yeah, thank you all so much. And should I just pop off now, or I don't know if you guys want to wait for anything or.
Thank you for your time. It was really interesting.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, it was really fun to be here. All right, everybody. Well, I'm going to pop off, but have a good rest of your event and talk to you in the future. Bye.
Okay, bye. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you everyone for coming. Bye.